The small group of humans huddled together in the cold, barren landscape of an alien world. For weeks they had been stuck here, far from the safety of Earth, and now their chances of survival seemed slim. The planet they had landed on was nothing like they expected, desolate, harsh, and full of dangers they hadn't anticipated. They had tried to contact Earth, but nothing had come through. Their communication systems had failed, leaving them stranded without any hope of rescue. At first, they had thought the situation would improve. They believed their allies would come for them soon. But as the days stretched into weeks, then months, they began to realize that Earth had forgotten about them. The supplies they had brought with them were running out, and the food they could forage was barely enough to keep them going. The temperature at night dropped to dangerous levels, and the storms that whipped across the land were relentless. There were only 6 of them left now. The rest had died off, either from a harsh environment or the strange creatures that roamed the planet. The survivors were tired, broken, and desperate. The hope that had once burned bright in their hearts had faded, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. They knew they were on the verge of perishing, and no one seemed to care. Among the survivors, Marcus was the one who had held on to hope the longest. He was the leader, the one who kept the others together even when everything seemed lost. He had been the one to organize their survival efforts, the one to keep their spirits high when they thought all was lost. But now, even he had run out of ideas. They had tried everything: scavenging for food, building shelters, trying to repair their communication systems, but nothing had worked. Each day felt like a slow march to the inevitable. "Why hasn't anyone come?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. She was the youngest of the group, barely out of her teens, and her eyes were wide with the raw terror of their situation. "We've sent out so many signals. Why hasn't Earth responded?" Marcus didn't have an answer for her. He had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. The truth was, he didn't know. Earth had promised they would never be abandoned. Earth had promised they would always be protected. But now it felt like a cruel joke. They were left here to die, forgotten by the very people they had once called their brothers and sisters. "We just need to hold on a little longer," Marcus said, though even he didn't believe his own words anymore. They had no more food left. Their water reserves were nearly empty, and the shelter they had built was barely holding up against the constant storms. Each day, they watched as the planet slowly took away their strength, and they had nothing left to fight with. That night, as the wind howled outside, they sat around their small campfire. The flames flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the ground. There was nothing but silence between them. No one spoke of hope anymore. No one believed in rescue. The only thing that kept them going now was the thought that they could die together, in the company of the people they knew best. Suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a hum, deep and resonant, like the vibrations of something massive moving through the atmosphere. It was coming from the sky. Sarah was the first to stand up. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. The others looked up, and their eyes widened as a series of bright lights appeared in the dark sky. They blinked in and out, like distant stars, but much closer and moving faster than any natural object in the sky. They weren't stars. "Is it a ship?" whispered James, another survivor. His voice was shaky, but there was a hint of hope in his words. It had to be. What else could it be? After all these weeks, could it finally be Earth? Could it finally be their rescue? Marcus squinted into the sky, trying to make sense of the lights. They seemed to be moving in an organized pattern, getting closer, coming down toward them. His heart began to race. "It has to be," he muttered. "It has to be." But a nagging doubt gnawed at him. What if it wasn't Earth? What if it was something else, something more dangerous? The last thing they needed was to be caught in the middle of another fight, another battle. But at this point, he knew they had no choice but to hope. Hope was all they had left. The lights grew brighter, filling the sky with a blinding glow. The sound grew louder, vibrating the ground beneath them. The group backed away from the campfire, eyes locked on the descending lights. The air felt thick, charged with energy. Then, a voice crackled through their communication system. Weak, static-filled, but unmistakable. "This is Earth Command. We've located your position. Prepare for immediate extraction." Marcus couldn't believe it. They weren't going to die here after all. After all this time, they were finally being saved. The Earth's deadliest fleet was coming for them. But as the lights neared, the group could not help but feel a growing unease. Something didn't seem right. Their rescue was almost too perfect, too timely. They didn't know what was coming, but the tension in the air was thick, and they couldn't shake the feeling that their nightmare might just be beginning. The strange lights in the sky grew brighter with each passing second, and the hum of something massive vibrating through the air intensified. The group stood frozen, their eyes wide with both awe and fear. For so long, they had believed they were completely alone on this forsaken planet. But now, there was something else, something approaching them. The air seemed charged, like the calm before a storm, and every fiber of their being screamed that something was coming, something powerful. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his throat dry. "I see it." The lights weren't like any aircraft they had ever seen. They weren't normal searchlights or ships that followed predictable patterns. They danced through the atmosphere with precision and grace, moving in a way that seemed almost purposeful. It was as though the lights were searching for something, pinpointing their location with an uncanny accuracy. They weren't just a random occurrence. This was no natural phenomenon. This was something planned. The hum grew louder, and now it was more than just sound. It was a vibration that rattled through the ground, sending shivers up their spines. The air felt heavy, and even though the temperature was freezing, a bead of sweat appeared on Marcus's forehead. The sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of hope, fear, and confusion. Their rescue had come, but what did it mean? Who were these people, or beings, that were coming for them? "Should we prepare for battle?" James asked, his hand instinctively moving to the gun he carried. His voice was filled with a mixture of tension and readiness. The fear of being caught off guard after all this time was overwhelming. If this was an alien ship, they needed to be ready to fight for their lives. Marcus shook his head, his mind racing. "We don't know what this is, but we need to stay calm. We can't just assume the worst." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. What if it was the worst? What if this was some kind of trap, set by an enemy they didn't even know existed? Or worse, what if it wasn't a rescue at all? The lights had now grown so bright they were blinding, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was almost a physical presence, vibrating through the air around them. Their hearts raced as they watched the lights approach with terrifying speed. There was no escape now. They had no choice but to face whatever was coming. And then, it happened. A massive ship, easily the size of a skyscraper, broke through the clouds above them, descending slowly. Its hull gleamed with a metallic sheen, reflecting the eerie glow of its lights. It was a ship unlike anything they had ever seen before, sleek, powerful, and intimidating. There were no visible engines, no wings, just a smooth surface, like the ship itself was made for one purpose: to destroy. The group took a step back, their breath catching in their throats. This was no ordinary rescue mission. Whoever or whatever was aboard this ship, they weren't just here to help. The sheer size of the vessel suggested that it was a force to be reckoned with, an instrument of power, not mercy. The ship hovered above them, and for a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped moving. The wind died down, and the air grew still. No one spoke, each person lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation. They had been on this planet for so long, surviving on scraps, hoping for a miracle. Now, the miracle had arrived, but with it came an unsettling question. What did Earth's deadliest fleet really want from them? Suddenly, the silence was broken by a deep, commanding voice that echoed through the speakers of their communication devices. The voice was clear, precise, and undeniably authoritative. "This is Earth Command. We've located your position. Prepare for immediate extraction." The group stood in stunned silence. It was Earth. They had made it. They weren't going to die on this forsaken planet after all. They were going home. But even as hope surged through Marcus's chest, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The voice that spoke to them was not comforting. It wasn't a voice filled with warmth or relief. It was cold, detached, almost clinical. "Immediate extraction." Sarah repeated in disbelief. We're finally being saved." Marcus didn't answer her right away. His mind was spinning, and his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Why the urgency? Why had they waited so long to rescue them? And why were they being extracted so quickly, without any real contact or explanation? He looked around at the others. James was gripping his gun tighter now, his face tense with suspicion. Sarah, though she seemed relieved, still had a look of unease in her eyes. No one knew what to make of this sudden change in their fate. The ship continued its descent, and the massive shadow of it loomed over them. It was so close now that they could see the details of the hull, metallic plates, strange markings, and what appeared to be weapon systems along the sides. This was no typical rescue ship. This was a warship. "I don't trust this," Marcus muttered, his voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" James asked, his hand still on his weapon. "They're coming to rescue us." Marcus didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the descending ship, his mind racing through every possible scenario. They had been abandoned for so long, left to die in this godforsaken place. Now, out of nowhere, this fleet arrives, and they are promised an immediate extraction. Too much was happening too fast. It all felt off. "We don't know who's on that ship or what they want," Marcus said quietly. "This may be our rescue, but it could also be something far worse." As the ship touched down with a thunderous rumble, the group stepped back, instinctively bracing themselves for whatever came next. The door of the ship began to open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The air around them crackled with tension. No one knew what was waiting for them inside, but one thing was certain: their survival depended on what happened next. The massive ship's door opened slowly, revealing a dark interior. For a moment, the survivors just stood there, unsure of what to do. The air around them was thick with anticipation, the silence oppressive. There was no welcoming voice, no sign of a friendly hand ready to pull them to safety. Instead, the figure in the doorway stood motionless, cloaked in shadows. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. This wasn't how he imagined their rescue. The ship had arrived, sure, but now, the tension was unbearable. Why hadn't anyone stepped forward to greet them? Why was everything so cold, so clinical? His mind raced with questions, but there was no time to consider the answers. They had to make a decision. One by one, the survivors exchanged uncertain glances. Then, slowly, Marcus stepped forward, trying to look confident, though doubt gnawed at him. "We're ready for extraction," he called out, his voice sounding small against the overwhelming silence. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, the person, or whatever it was, simply stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The ship's interior was as cold and stark as the exterior. It looked more like a military facility than a rescue ship. No warmth, no welcoming signs of life. Just metal walls, dim lighting, and a palpable feeling of something not quite right. "We have to go," Sarah whispered to Marcus, her eyes wide. She was younger, eager to get out of this nightmare, but even she could sense the unease that filled the air. The survivors all moved as one, stepping into the ship cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner for signs of danger. As they entered, the doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy, resounding clang, and the ship hummed to life. The ship's engines roared quietly, vibrating through the floor beneath them. It was clear now. They were leaving the planet. The gravity that had been so oppressive on the surface now felt lighter, as if they were being pulled upward by something far beyond their control. The ship rose, and they were on their way. But where to? Inside, the survivors were met with stark, utilitarian surroundings. There was no comfort here. No food stations, no relaxing areas, nothing to show signs of life, except for the solitary figure leading them down a cold hallway. It was a man. At least, he looked human. He was tall, with a steely expression on his face. His uniform was black, decorated with strange insignias that none of them recognized. "We are not here to comfort you." The man's voice cut through the silence. His words were blunt, his tone devoid of any empathy. "You are here because Earth has a mission for you." The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. They hadn't even been asked if they wanted to be rescued. No choice, no explanation. Just orders. What kind of mission? Marcus asked, trying to maintain his composure. The man's eyes flickered briefly to Marcus, but he didn't answer the question. Instead, he stopped and turned toward a heavy door at the end of the hallway. The survivors halted, unsure of what would come next. "Follow me," the man said simply before entering the room. The survivors followed reluctantly, one by one, unsure of what awaited them. Inside, the room was much more advanced than anything they had seen on the planet's surface. It looked like a command center, with glowing screens displaying data Marcus couldn't understand. The entire room seemed to hum with activity, the walls lined with technology that looked both alien and familiar. Officers moved silently in the background, their faces hidden behind helmets and visors. These weren't regular soldiers. These were elite forces, each movement calculated, each step a part of something much bigger than themselves. The man leading them stood in front of a large screen and turned to face the group. "Your mission is simple," he said. "You are to serve Earth's interests in this sector. Earth does not take kindly to failures. You were abandoned for a reason. Your survival here is an asset. Do not forget that." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. We're not just being rescued, are we?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "No," the man replied flatly. "You are being recruited." The words hit like a punch to the gut. They had been abandoned, left to die. And now, they were being told they were part of some larger agenda. Were they a tool? A resource? Or something worse? "We've all survived," Sarah spoke up, her voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he activated a series of holographic displays that hovered in the air before them. Images of distant planets, military strategies, and various alien species filled the room. The survivors stared at the images, their eyes wide with confusion. "This," the man said, pointing to the holographic map, "is the galaxy as Earth sees it. And this," he pointed to a small planet on the map, "is where you will be stationed. It is a world on the verge of war, and your role will be crucial in securing it for Earth's future." Marcus looked at the others. They had survived the harsh planet, only to be thrown into something much darker. "So, we're not being rescued," he muttered. "We're being used." The man's expression didn't change. "You were never meant to be rescued. You were a liability, an experiment. Your survival has proven valuable. And now you will serve Earth's needs." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Marcus felt his stomach twist in a knot. This wasn't a rescue. It was a betrayal, a manipulation of the worst kind. They were no longer survivors. They were pawns in someone else's game. The group exchanged nervous glances. The door slammed shut behind them, locking them in. There was no way back. They were already too far from the planet to turn around. There was only one way forward. But where would it lead them? The ship continued its course through the vast expanse of space, and Marcus knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The ship's corridors were silent as the survivors walked down them, each step heavier than the last. Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and each new piece of information only added to the unease that had settled in his chest. They had been given no choice, no chance to ask questions, and no time to adjust. They were being swept into something far beyond their understanding. The man in the black uniform, the one who had given them the cold orders, led them to a stark, large room where they were to be briefed on their new mission. But the atmosphere in the room was not one of military efficiency. It was colder, more calculating. As they entered, a large holographic display flickered to life before them, showing a map of a distant, uncharted star system. It was a strange world, a place where human presence was minimal, and the need for control was evident. "The planet you will be stationed on is a critical asset to Earth," the man explained, his voice as detached as ever. "It is rich in resources, but it is also embroiled in conflict. Several factions vie for control of it, and Earth has deemed it necessary to secure it at all costs." Sarah, still processing what had been said, spoke up. "You're asking us to fight for Earth, to help them take control of this planet." The man turned his cold gaze toward her, his eyes unreadable. "You will be doing more than fighting. You will be integrating with local forces, gathering intelligence, and, if necessary, eliminating threats. The situation is volatile, and your skills, what you've already proven capable of, make you ideal for this mission." Marcus could feel the blood draining from his face. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't even about returning home. They had become something worse than soldiers. They were tools, resources to be used until they no longer had any value. And the longer he stayed quiet, the more he realized they had no way out. "No one asked us if we wanted to be part of this," Marcus said through clenched teeth. "We were left behind, abandoned. Now you expect us to just sign up for whatever mission you've decided for us." The man didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. "The decision was made long before you ever stepped foot on that planet. You survived, and now you will serve Earth's interests. Your reluctance is irrelevant." The others remained silent, the weight of the situation sinking in. They had no choice, no say in what happened next. The moment they had stepped aboard this ship, they had signed away their freedom. They would either comply or face the unknown consequences of defiance. "You've all demonstrated resilience," the man continued, as though reading from a script. "You survived on a hostile planet for months. Earth values that. We value that. But in return, we expect loyalty." The word echoed in Marcus's mind. Loyalty. To what? To Earth? To a system that had abandoned them? To people who saw them as expendable? "If you're not loyal, you're a liability," the man finished, his voice growing colder. "And we do not tolerate liabilities." James, who had been silent up until now, spoke up, his voice low and filled with suspicion. "What happens if we say no? What if we don't want to do this?" The man's eyes narrowed. "There are no alternatives. Earth has given you a choice. Serve or remain stranded. You will fight, gather intelligence, or be eliminated. Your continued survival depends on your usefulness." Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. They were caught in a trap, and there was no way out. Their loyalty, or their ability to be useful, was the only thing that could ensure their survival. They were pawns in a game they didn't understand, thrust into a conflict far beyond their comprehension. The fear of failure was almost palpable. If they didn't succeed, if they didn't prove their worth, they would be discarded. It was the harsh reality of the world they had been thrust into. There was no safety net. No one would come to save them this time. "Now," the man said, snapping the survivors back to the present, "we begin the training. The mission begins soon. You will each be assigned to a team. Your survival will depend on your ability to adapt." As the briefing continued, Marcus found himself barely able to focus on the man's words. His mind kept returning to the question that had been haunting him since they first entered the ship. Why had Earth left them on that planet in the first place? What had changed in those months of silence that made them worthy of rescue now? And most of all, Why had they been chosen for this mission? He glanced at Sarah, who looked as lost as he felt. Her face, once full of hope, was now marked with fear and confusion. She was just a kid, no more than 18, and she had been thrust into this nightmare with no warning. "Do you think they'll really let us go back?" she whispered to Marcus, her voice filled with doubt. He shook his head, though he wasn't sure of the answer. "I don't think we have a choice anymore." The room was filled with the soft hum of machinery, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The man in charge continued to explain their new roles, the mission parameters, and the high expectations that would be placed on them. But Marcus couldn't hear most of it. He couldn't focus on the details. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out, any way out. But the reality was clear. There was no escape. They were in it now. There was no going back. The only option was to move forward, into the unknown, into the heart of a war that wasn't theirs to fight. And if they failed? That was a question Marcus didn't even want to consider. The days aboard the ship passed in a blur, each one feeling like a repetition of the last. The survivors were shuffled through training sessions, each one more intense than the last. They were pushed to their limits, their bodies and minds tested in ways they had never imagined. But even with all the physical drills and combat simulations, nothing prepared them for what lay ahead, the mission itself. Marcus spent most of his time in quiet reflection, his mind racing with every question and scenario he could think of. The cold, detached training officers drilled them relentlessly, giving them little room to breathe, let alone think. But as the days went on, one thing became clearer. This wasn't just about survival. This was about loyalty. The kind of loyalty that could make or break everything. The kind that could decide whether they lived or died. The group was kept apart most of the time, each of them assigned to different training modules. When they did have time together, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she kept silent. James, who had always been quick to speak out, seemed to have swallowed his words, his hands constantly clenched in fists as though he were preparing for something terrible. Then one morning, they were summoned to the command deck. The ship had been traveling for what felt like weeks, but in reality, it had only been a few days since their training began. Marcus didn't know what to expect, but when the doors to the command deck slid open, he was immediately hit by the overwhelming hum of advanced technology. The room was dominated by a massive holographic display, showing the distant planet they were meant to invade. The man in black, the officer who had spoken to them before, was standing in front of the display, his posture rigid, his face as expressionless as ever. He turned to face the group as they entered. "It's time," he said, his voice cold, unwavering. "Your mission begins now." The survivors exchanged looks, none of them knowing what exactly was expected of them. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest, a tightness in his throat. For all the training, for all the preparations, there was no escaping the reality that none of them were truly ready for what lay ahead. Not really. The planet you'll be deployed to is called Virex. It's rich in resources, but it's also a war zone. The officer continued, his voice flat. There are factions vying for control of the planet. Your objective is to assist Earth in securing the resources, and if necessary, neutralize any threats. The holographic map zoomed in on the planet's surface, showing battle zones, military outposts, and areas marked in red, indicating high levels of conflict. Marcus could almost feel the tension in the room intensify as they all realized the magnitude of what they were about to do. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were soldiers in a war they had no part in, being sent to fight on behalf of a planet that had discarded them. One of the survivors, a man named Ivan, stepped forward. His voice was strained, but he didn't back down. "Why us?" he asked, his words almost cutting through the thick silence. "Why did Earth leave us on that planet? Why didn't we get a real rescue until now?" The officer's eyes flickered toward him, but he didn't answer right away. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever before he spoke again, his voice colder than ever. "You were never left behind," the officer said. "Earth didn't abandon you. You were a test. Your survival was part of a larger strategy. You were always meant to serve." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The truth was finally out in the open, and it felt like a weight pressing on Marcus's chest. They weren't people to Earth. They weren't even survivors. They were tools, pawns in a larger game. And now they were being thrust into the heart of it. "What happens if we refuse?" James spoke up, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "What if we don't want to fight?" The officer's expression didn't change. "Refusal isn't an option. Earth is in control, and you will follow orders. That is the only path to survival." The words hit like a hammer, and Marcus felt the anger bubbling up inside him. They had been stripped of their choices, their autonomy. They were no longer people, they were soldiers. And soldiers didn't get to ask questions. They didn't get to choose their path. The officer turned back to the holographic map, seemingly indifferent to the tension in the room. "The operation begins in 3 days. You will be dropped in the capital city of Virex, where the Earth fleet has already established a foothold. From there, you will proceed to secure the resource zones, neutralize any local militias, and assist in the capture of key leaders." The briefing continued, but Marcus couldn't focus anymore. His thoughts were too clouded, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. He kept hearing the officer's words repeating in his mind. "You were always meant to serve." It was like a mantra, a constant reminder that their lives, everything they had fought for, had always been about serving someone else's purpose. They were no longer in control of their fate. They were just soldiers, tools to be used until they were no longer needed. The meeting ended, and the survivors were dismissed. As they left the command deck, the gravity of the situation hit harder than ever. There was no turning back now. They were going to war, not because they had a choice, but because they had been chosen for something they couldn't possibly understand. As they walked down the cold, metallic hallway, Sarah spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her words raw with emotion. "No one did," Marcus replied quietly, his mind still racing. "But it's too late to back out now." The ship hummed around them, the sound filling the empty spaces between them as they made their way back to their quarters. The tension among them was palpable, but no one spoke. There were no more questions, no more arguments. They were soldiers now, whether they liked it or not. And the only thing they could do was move forward, into the unknown, where their survival depended not on their strength or will, but on their ability to follow orders and stay useful to Earth. They didn't know what awaited them on Virex, but they were about to find out. The next few days on the ship were a blur of preparation and silent tension. The survivors were given weapons, armor, and advanced gear, tools designed for a mission none of them had ever anticipated. The training had been brutal, and the reality of what they were about to face began to set in. They were no longer mere survivors of a failed planet, abandoned by Earth. They were soldiers now, soldiers sent to carry out orders they didn't fully understand. Marcus found himself staring out of the small observation window in his quarters, watching the stars pass by as the ship neared its destination. Virex loomed ahead, a planet caught in the chaos of war, its surface scarred by years of conflict. The thought of what they were about to do, what they were about to become, filled him with dread. The night before the mission, the survivors gathered in a small room, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them. They were quiet, the silence heavy with unspoken fear and confusion. There was no escape from this, no way to turn back. The realization settled over them all like a blanket of cold steel. "I don't understand." Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. "Why us? Why were we chosen for this? Why not someone else?" Marcus couldn't answer her. No one could. The man in black had made it clear. They had no say in the matter. They were pawns in a much larger game. their survival on that abandoned planet only a stepping stone to something far darker. James spoke up, his voice rough. Because we're expendable. Because we survived when no one thought we could. Earth sees that as an asset, but we're not human to them anymore. We're just tools. There was a pause, and for a moment, Marcus could feel the weight of those words sinking into him. The survivors had been chosen because they had survived. They had proven they could endure. But what kind of world was it where survival was a currency, and they were being sent to fight in a war that wasn't theirs? We have to stick together, Even said, his voice resolute. If we're going to get through this, we have to watch each other's backs. We can't trust anyone but ourselves. The others nodded, but Marcus could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for this. They were ordinary people who had been thrust into a nightmare, and now they were expected to carry out a mission that had no meaning to them. They had been abandoned once, and now they were being used again. The briefing came early the next morning, and the survivors were ushered to the command deck. The ship had already entered the atmosphere of Virex, the planet's surface visible through the viewports. The clouds were dark, swirling with the remnants of a war that had raged for years. From orbit, the planet looked like a fractured world, torn apart by the greed and violence of countless factions. "This is it," the officer in black said, his voice cold as always. "Your mission is simple. You will be deployed into the capital city, where Earth's forces are already in place. Your objective is to assist in securing key infrastructure and resources. If necessary, you will engage in combat and neutralize any threats." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them all, as if evaluating their readiness. "Remember, your survival depends on your ability to adapt to this environment. Failure is not an option." The survivors stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. They were about to be dropped into a war zone, but it wasn't their war. They weren't fighting for a cause they believed in. They were fighting because they had no choice. Earth had made that clear. And the more they learned, the more they realized that their lives had always been disposable in the eyes of those who sent them here. "Ready yourselves," the officer continued, his tone unwavering. "In 2 hours, you will be deployed. Make no mistake, the success of this mission is crucial for Earth's interests in this sector." With that, the survivors were dismissed, left to prepare for the mission that lay ahead. Marcus couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. There was no escape from this, no way to change their fate. They had been taken from their homes, abandoned on a desolate planet, and now they were being sent to fight for a cause that meant nothing to them. The mission was no longer about survival. It was about control, and they had no say in it. As they suited up in their combat gear, Marcus could feel the weight of the armor pressing down on him, the heaviness of the weapon in his hands. This wasn't the person he had been when he first landed on the planet. He had been a man trying to survive, trying to make it out alive. But now he was something else, a soldier, a pawn in a game that wasn't his to play. The ship descended toward Virex, and the hum of the engines vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. The survivors were seated in the drop zone, ready for the moment that would change everything. The door to the drop bay slid open, and the cold, unforgiving air of Virex rushed in. The planet's surface was a jagged landscape of mountains and valleys, broken only by the occasional city or military outpost. The man in black gave them one last look before they exited the ship. "Good luck," he said, though his tone offered no comfort. "You'll need it." Marcus didn't say anything in return. The door opened fully, and they stepped out, the wind whipping at their faces as the ground below grew closer. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for them to make their landing. As they hit the ground with a heavy thud, Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The mission had begun. There was no turning back now. The soldiers around them moved with military precision, their faces hidden behind helmets, their movements calculated. The survivors, though, were out of place. They were the untrained, the unwilling. They had been dragged into this war, and now they had to fight. The city ahead was a war zone, a place where no one was safe. The factions that fought over it had no interest in peace. They were battling for control, and Earth had decided it was time to stake its claim. The survivors, now soldiers, moved into the heart of the city. They didn't know what they would face. They didn't know who the enemy was or where they would strike next. All they knew was that they had a mission to complete, and if they failed, the consequences would be far worse than anything they could imagine. The city loomed ahead, dark and broken, and the mission was about to unfold. The city of Virex was nothing like Marcus had expected. It was a sprawling metropolis, once thriving and vibrant, now reduced to a battleground. The once impressive skyline was now crumbled and broken, with burned-out buildings rising like skeletal remains from the ashen streets below. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and something far more sinister, a lingering sense of despair. As the survivors moved deeper into the city, the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions rumbled in the background. The war had already torn the city apart, and now they were here, caught in the middle of it all. Marcus's hands gripped his weapon tightly as he followed the others, each of them moving cautiously through the ruins. The mission had begun, but the fear that had been bubbling inside him for days now threatened to spill over. They were assigned to clear a path toward the Central Command, where Earth's forces were supposed to be establishing a foothold. The mission seemed simple on paper: secure key locations, neutralize any threats, and assist in the takeover of the capital. But as they made their way through the wreckage, Marcus realized that simplicity was an illusion. This wasn't a clean operation. This wasn't a matter of following orders and going home. This was a battle for survival. The first resistance came in the form of a small group of soldiers, wearing the insignia of a local militia. They had been hiding in the shadows, watching the survivors approach. As soon as they spotted them, shots rang out, breaking the eerie silence. The survivors scrambled for cover, returning fire as they fought to protect themselves. Marcus's heart raced as he fired his weapon, his thoughts blurring together in the chaos. This was it. This was what they had been trained for, or at least what they had been forced into. The militia soldiers were fierce, but they were disorganized. The survivors, though untrained, had an edge: desperation. They fought with everything they had, pushing through their fear and confusion. It was over quickly, the militia soldiers retreating into the ruins, leaving the survivors standing in the middle of the street, panting and shaken. "Keep moving," one of the Earth soldiers barked, his face cold and indifferent as he motioned for them to follow. "We don't have time for this." But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much bigger. The militia had been one small piece of the puzzle, and there were much larger forces at play here. He couldn't help but wonder how many more factions were lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. As they pressed on, the city grew darker. The further they went, the more they encountered signs of the destruction the war had brought. Buildings were reduced to rubble, streets were littered with debris, and the once thriving marketplaces were now ghost towns. But there were signs of life. Military patrols, civilians hiding in the cracks of the city, people trying to survive in a place that had no mercy for them. It wasn't long before they reached a checkpoint, a fortified position manned by Earth's forces. The survivors were stopped and scanned, their gear checked, and their weapons confirmed. It was a reminder that they were not part of Earth's army. They were outsiders, soldiers only by necessity, and every step they took was monitored. No one trusted them, not really. They were expendable. "This is where we split up," the officer in black said, pointing toward a narrow alley that led deeper into the city. "You will secure the eastern sector, neutralize any local resistance, and report back. Your objective is simple: don't fail." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances. They had been fighting for their lives since they first landed on the planet. But this was different. This wasn't just about staying alive. They were now part of something far bigger. They were tools in a war they didn't understand, following orders they didn't agree with. But there was no turning back now. The officer in black was right. Failure wasn't an option. They had to push forward, no matter what. The eastern sector was a maze of narrow streets and abandoned buildings, each corner seeming to hide a new danger. The survivors moved cautiously, their weapons ready. Every sound, every movement, felt amplified in the tense atmosphere. The city was alive with conflict, and they were right in the middle of it. Marcus could hear the distant sounds of battle, but it wasn't just the military that fought. There were civilians, too, caught in the crossfire. And the survivors were no different. They were just another group trying to make it out alive. At one point, as they moved through the alleyways, they stumbled upon a small group of civilians, women, children, and elderly people, huddled together in an abandoned building. They looked up at the survivors with fearful eyes, their faces hollow from weeks of hiding and surviving in the chaos of war. "Please," one of the women said, her voice trembling, "don't hurt us. We're just trying to survive." Marcus's heart ached as he looked at them. They weren't soldiers. They weren't enemies. They were just people, trying to live in a world that had forgotten them. But in the eyes of the officers, in the eyes of Earth, they were nothing more than obstacles, people to be ignored, or worse, eliminated. "We're not here to hurt you," Marcus said, trying to reassure them. "We're just trying to do our job." The woman nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. They weren't safe here. No one was safe. The survivors continued their mission, leaving the civilians behind, but Marcus couldn't shake the image of their frightened faces. They had been sent here to fight a war that wasn't theirs. They had been thrown into the heart of a conflict that was as much about power as it was about survival. The mission continued, and as they neared their objective, the survivors couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had become. They were no longer innocent bystanders. They were soldiers in a war that was not their own, fighting for a cause they didn't believe in. But in the end, they had no choice. They had been made part of something much bigger, something far beyond their control. And as they reached the Central Command, where Earth's forces were gathered, Marcus realized that the battle was far from over. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of the war that awaited them. The true cost of their survival, of their loyalty, was yet to be revealed. The survivors had come to the city to fulfill their mission. But in doing so, they had become something else, something they couldn't escape. The world they had known was gone, and in its place stood a future where survival meant submission, where loyalty meant obedience, and where freedom was a dream that had long since died. The war was just beginning.